This is the David Doel Show on In-Depth Radio, News Talk 1010.
Welcome to the David Doel Show, your rational look at news, politics, and culture, right here on In-Depth Radio, News Talk 1010. I, of course, am your host, David Doel, and coming up on today's show, what is the Ford government slashing funding to now? And their attempt to bury the news in a late Friday email may signal how unpopular these cuts are. Also, pathetic man-child Donald Trump gets triggered once again by SNL, and I take your calls challenging you to name anyone more thin-skinned than Donald Trump. And later on in the show, politics in the UK is heating up. I'll update you on what's going on with Theresa May's Brexit deal and why we may see a new prime minister there soon. All that and more coming up on the David Doel Show. But first, I am joined in studio by D.T. Cochrane, a lecturer in business and society at York University, and the author of the piece titled Canada Needs Its Own Green New Deal, which you can read at theconversation.com. DT, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, David.
So your piece is fantastic. And one thing I noticed while reading it is you seem to be as plugged in as maybe I am into American politics and sort of what's happening right now with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and some other Democrats in the party that are pushing for a Green New Deal. So what exactly, in your mind, is a Green New Deal, and what does it mean for Canada?
So the label of a Green New Deal, of course, harkens back to the efforts of the United States to deal with the Great Depression and an attempt to kickstart their economy. And it led the U.S. government to get much more involved in the economy. And there was a big boost in government spending, and it made up a much larger proportion of the U.S. economy. And at that time, the effort was simply to get America working again, get American productivity going again. The attachment of the label of a Green New Deal says that the aim is not simply productivity per se. We now need a specific type of productivity. We don't just need to drive the economy forward. We need economic transformation. Mm-hmm. And I really like the message of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the other primarily young women of color who are leading this effort, that they are saying at one and the same time, we can confront the climate crisis and pursue economic justice, that these two things can go hand in hand through something called a Green New Deal. I think it's important to understand what the limitations of the original New Deal were and then put that in the context of World War II, which was when the American economy really got kick-started. And the government involvement in the economy for World War II was orders of magnitude much greater than what it had initially undertaken with the New Deal. I'm always reluctant to describe non-wars in war terms, but I think the effort that's required to deal with climate disintegration requires something on par with that of the U.S. effort during World War II, when government spending relative to the years prior increased 500%. And one of the points I make in the piece was if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the others are successful, and that would be huge, and Canada is a laggard, then we are going to be left behind. We can either lead in this or we can follow. And I think it's very important that we be followers in this. And we have the opportunity to do so because we have one meager step forward with carbon pricing, but that needs to just be the beginning. We need to follow that up with much more aggressive efforts.
So what do you say to people that say, well, how can we possibly afford that? How can we possibly afford to invest into our economy? How can we possibly afford to have a Green New Deal to really to really transform our economy and our society for this new generation of renewable energy? What do you say to the cost issue of that?
So the first thing I would say would be aping something that Ocasio-Cortez has said, that let's think about what issues that question is raised about. Let's think about what people say, oh, how can we possibly afford that? And that tells you a lot about the society in which you live, where her talking in the US context said, where were these questions about the Space Force? These questions get raised about something far more serious. But secondarily, and even more importantly, it's a profound misunderstanding of how how the monetary system works. The Canadian government gets frequently analogized to a household, and that is completely wrong. So organizations like the Canadian Federation of Taxpayers, you have a lot of pundits who they'll say, oh, Canada is spending more than it's taking in. It's running deficit after deficit after deficit. Its debt is just continually growing. That's no way to run a household. The government is not a household. Mm-hmm. The government can print its own money. Mm-hmm. The government can borrow money from itself. It can put as much money out into the economy as it wishes. And this is exactly what the US government had to do during World War II. It pushed tons and tons of financial resources out into the economy as part of the transformation of the economy to a wartime setting. So the Canadian government can do the same thing. It can push financial resources out into the economy to try to direct it from where it's headed right now, which is in a climate destructive direction, towards a pursuit of climate integrity, or at the very least, trying to prepare Canada for the coming crisis that will have all kinds of qualitative effects that we don't even necessarily foresee yet.
Mm-hmm. So what you're discussing there is MMT, so modern monetary theory. I really suggest people, if you're listening to this, when you get home, or if you're home now, look up MMT, look up modern monetary theory, watch a YouTube video on it, and really understand the situation we're in terms of our ability, as DD was saying, to print our own money, to really invest into our economy, into our society, and how that will benefit us if we do that. So, as you were alluding to, I mean, in the U.S., they just increased military spending, gave a 1-point-something billion tax cut for the rich. I mean, they're able to do that because of MMT. MMT has been used in a negative way to benefit those at the top, but we can use it to actually benefit our society, to actually reinvest into our society. So, going off that, what exactly, so for people listening at home, what would be the impact for, say, the average Canadian if we were to implement a Green New Deal?
So I first just want to briefly touch on an important distinction to be made in MMT, where on the one hand, it's a theory of how the monetary system actually works. And in that, from that perspective, it's not really something that's up for debate. They describe the way monetary systems actually function. And this is simply the case. If you go and look at Canadian government documents about where money actually comes from, it is described in precisely these terms. And printing money is a bit of a misnomer. It's just a few keystrokes, and the Bank of Canada can move millions, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars into the Canadian government's account. The other aspect of it then is the ethical perspective. Okay, once we understand that this is how the monetary system works, what do we do with that? Mm-hmm. And a lot of the proponents of MMT, not all of them, but a lot of them are on board with the idea of a Green New Deal, saying, okay, the US government can put trillions of dollars out into the economy, and it should do so towards transforming the economy into a zero emissions, carbon neutral footing. Now, back to your question, what would it mean for Canada? It would mean absolute and utter economic transformation. It would mean jobs that exist right now would cease to exist, but the government would be able to step in and provide the funds to do retraining, to establish new industries that are specifically intended to be carbon neutral. I think there's lots of grounds for Canada to be a leader in research and development of new energy technologies, of new transit technologies. Canada is a huge country. We have lots of remote communities. We're very dependent on fossil fuels to transport people and goods between those communities. Mm-hmm. We need to solve that problem. That's a huge problem. That will require a ton of research and development. We have the brain power. We have the labor power. We are a resource-rich country, so we have the resources. It simply requires a financial impetus of the government pushing the funds into those sorts of areas.
Mm-hmm. So I'm talking with D.T. Cochrane, a lecturer in business and society at York University and the author of the piece titled Canada Needs Its Own Green New Deal, which you can read at theconversation.com. So going off what you were saying there, one of the investments that I think we could potentially make as an example of this is the GM plant. So the GM is giving up their plant in Oshawa. How could, in this idea of a Green New Deal, how could the Canadian government sort of use that plant as a jumping off point for this idea?
So in the piece, I offer just some very kind of quick suggestions about what that could look like. The Canadian government could absolutely buy that plant. It could keep all of the workers that currently employed there employed, and it could transform that plant from a private for-profit undertaking producing trucks intended for the consumer market towards research and development and production of forward-looking, zero-emission transportation technology. It could become a hub of research and development. It could be a kind of a testing ground. And beyond that, it could be a place where we try out new forms of economic organization. So that plant was operated ultimately in service of GM's bottom line. So everything else that might go on at that plant, it all had to make sense from the perspective of GM's bottom line. Is that really the way a plant like that should function? Should that be its baseline standard for success or failure? So in the piece, I kind of flippantly say that perhaps it should be turned into a workers' cooperative. All of these highly skilled, very intelligent auto workers, what could they do with that plant if they were given much more control over it? And in that way, it could serve not just to produce tangible goods that are of interest in our transition towards a post-carbon society. It could serve as a model for different ways of actually organizing the economy.
So this is, I guess, sort of related, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on the Trudeau government purchasing the $4.5 billion pipeline, because this is, I mean, in my opinion, this is money that could have been used to, say, do what you're saying with the GM plant, to purchase that and turn that into a worker cooperative. But what? So this $4.5 billion pipeline. What are your thoughts on that?
So it was effectively a bailout when Kinder Morgan announced that they were ceasing all non-necessary construction. The CEO at the time said that there was unquantifiable risk associated with this pipeline. And that's the death knell for any project. If you can't quantify risk, you can't quantify the project, and so then you can't proceed on the basis of the financial understanding that's required for these types of things. So the government stepping in kind of re-quantified it, now brought the project onto Canada's books. Ryerson professor Shiri Pasternak and Secwepemc land defender Kanahus Manuel, they wrote a piece for the Yellowhead Institute saying, okay, now we own it, let's kill it. Let's kill the expansion project because not only is that against our responsibility in terms of climate integrity, it completely goes against Indigenous rights, the people whose land the existing pipeline passes through and whose jurisdiction will be violated to try to construct this expansion. And I think that's exactly right for serving the other interest of our need to wind down tar sands production. That the tar sands make a huge contribution to global emissions. The pipeline serves that. Expanding the pipeline would only increase the incentives to extract from the tar sands, creating more emissions. So we own the pipeline. Let's bring the expansion for sure to an end, and let's start thinking about ways to start ramping down production from the tar sands, to start ramping down the bitumen flowing through the pipeline. Obviously, on the other end of that, we need to consider, okay, how is that going to affect Vancouver? How do we solve the issue of their current need for fossil fuels? A high desire in Vancouver to shift away from that. So you have the desire, again, you have the brain power, the labor power, you have the resources to make that transition. This is going to require an incredible amount of effort, an incredible amount of planning, none of which is going to come from the markets. So it's going to require bodies like the Canadian government with this pipeline in hand, able to say, okay, we're going to wind down production in the tar sands. We are going to kill the expansion of the Trans Mountain. We're going to ramp down the use of the pipeline, and we need to identify the problems that will come out of that, and then work to solve those problems, like the loss of jobs that exist in the tar sands. How are we going to deal with that? And the Canadian government is uniquely placed because of its ability to spend, because of its sovereign currency status, to solve these kinds of problems.
Now, one of the ways we've kind of wound down or supposedly tried to wind down our dependence on fossil fuels is through a carbon tax. Now, we see the uprising in France against the fuel tax there. Do you want to discuss sort of the limited ability for a carbon tax to really transform the economy the way we need it to be transformed, and also sort of why France is the people there are angry at this fuel tax?
So I'm absolutely an advocate for carbon pricing. Emissions are a form of what's called an externality. So in any kind of market transaction, the ideal of the market is that all costs and benefits get accounted for between the participants in that transaction. The reality is that lots of costs and some benefits end up overflowing the transaction, and other people bear those costs. And climate change is probably the biggest cost that's borne as an externality of all of the market transactions that create that create emissions. So putting a carbon price in place is one way to start accounting for that. That said, this pricing will affect different people disproportionately, and it will tend to affect poorer, more precariously placed people harder than wealthier people, despite the fact that the wealthier you are, the more responsibility you have for the current climate crisis. So the current opposition to carbon pricing is really a demand to maintain a carbon subsidy. So the Jason Kennys of the world, they're wanting to maintain a subsidy that's disguised in the market. By putting in place carbon pricing and recognizing that some people will be disproportionately harmed, then we can explicitly subsidize certain people to try to mitigate that harm. But all of this should be as transparent as it possibly can be. Okay, we're going to price carbon. Some people are going to be harmed by that. Let's identify who is harmed and how, and then intervene to assist them to mitigate that harm, and then try to offset it elsewhere, because part of that subsidy will generate more emissions. And so now we have responsibility to respond to that elsewhere. But this should all be as out in the open as we possibly can, instead of having this clandestine subsidy that exists with the lack of carbon pricing.
Yeah, and one of the issues in France was that the onus for climate change policy was falling onto the poor and the middle class, while the wealthy was sort of getting away with it, and they were getting tax breaks from Macron there. So, I mean, when you force the system onto the poor and the middle class, when you force the cuts onto them, or the impact you impact them the most, it's going to turn around, because you have to show that you are actually trying to invest into your people and not just benefit those at the top, which, as we see with neoliberal governments all over the world, we're seeing that again and again, where these are governments designed to listen to the powerful, to the wealthy, to corporations, while ignoring the needs of the poor and the middle class. I do want to ask you, so who should be the voice of a Green New Deal in Canada? So we have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the U.S. and a few other upcoming Democrats there. Bernie Sanders is a strong voice for climate change policy as well. But in Canada, I feel we don't have, at least very visible, strong leaders right now. Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the NDP, doesn't have a seat yet in the parliament. So who should be the voice of this, or who could be the voice of this in the future for a Green New Deal in Canada?
So the young, I think, are the ones who are getting more and more vocal. That young woman, Greta Thunberg, who spoke recently, she's a 15-year-old
Oh, yes.
who called out world leaders for their absolute and utter failure to deal with this crisis that we've now seen unfolding over decades. You have the Sunrise Movement in the U.S. There's a class action lawsuit by young people in the U.S. against the government saying, your lack of action is harming us because it's our future that you're relinquishing with your lack of action. A class action lawsuit was just launched by young people in Quebec that's moving forward. So I think we need to be really listening to young voices. I think we also need to be listening to Indigenous leaders, Indigenous people, especially those living on the land. They're the ones who've been seeing the effects of climate change for a long time. The group Indigenous Climate Action works to try to raise their voices. They're the ones who've witnessed the effects of climate change. Again, people who have contributed the least to it are the ones who are paying the prices. But they are also the ones who have, simply out of necessity, had to respond and alter the way they live on the land. So I think they have a lot of lessons to teach us about what sustainable living would look like, which I think would also go a long way towards reconciliation, which our government got elected on and has done next to nothing about. I would love to see the Federal Green Party really speak up about this. Unfortunately, they've tended to take a very market-based line. I don't know how much that's done for kind of marketability purposes. The NDP during the last federal election decided they should campaign on balanced budgets, which made absolutely no sense.
There has to be this real turn to the left because we are, letting this sort of ideology, where we're always looking for a market-based approach, always looking to the wealthy and to corporations for the answer. We have to really take a sort of a mental shift off of that. And I think part of the equation there, just to go to my last question here, is the media. So I think the media has really failed us as a whole in really educating our society on the need for real climate change policy, the need for something like a Green New Deal. So what do you think? How should, in a perfect world, how do you see the media covering climate change and our need to address it?
So there was a piece that went around a while ago saying that the media needs to be careful not to over sensationalize the dangers that are coming from climate change, because it can really turn people off. They can feel like this is absolutely and utterly hopeless. So they need to obviously report much more on the realities of climate change. They need to shut down any notion that there's two sides to this issue. The science of climate change is settled. The science of anthropogenic climate change is settled. This is happening. It's our fault. But there are solutions, not necessarily to reversing climate change, but to trying to prepare for the post-carbon future that's coming one way or another. So reporting much more widely on how climate change is affecting people and how people are responding to try to mitigate those effects, and what the shortcomings are in their ability to do so, which would be shortcomings that a powerful central body like the federal government is uniquely placed to assist with.
D.T. Cochrane is a lecturer in business and society at York University and the author of the piece titled Canada Needs Its Own Green New Deal, which you can read at theconversation.com. D.T., thanks for joining me.
Thanks again.
Coming up next, what is the Ford government slashing funding to now? And their attempt to bury the news may signal how unpopular these cuts are. This is the David Doel Show on In-Depth Radio, News Talk 1010.